Hi, everybody. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, author, and investigator, Patty Wilson. Patty, how you doing?
Hello. I'm doing fine, honey. How are you doing tonight?
Very well, thank you.
So tonight I was going to talk a little bit about military ghosts.
Okay.
There are literally tens of thousands of these stories. So I picked some that are most people might know a little bit about, and then I picked a couple of things that were interesting that I don't think many people know. So the first one we were going to visit is the USS Hornet. This was a ship that served in World War II in the Vietnam War. It was also used for the recovery of Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 missions.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if anybody knew that or not. Now, during its active service years, there were 300 members of the crew who died, either from accidents or suicides. That's a lot of people.
That certainly is.
I was shocked to find out there was that many. The ship is now permanently located in San Francisco, and consistently the staff there report stories about hearing voices, calling out to them, pranks being played on them, seeing the apparitions of soldiers walking ahead of them, or they'll hear steps behind them and look back and see somebody in World War II clothing. It is considered the most haunted ship in America. Now, one of the things I find interesting is that it likes to play, whatever the ghosts are there, they like to play with electronics. So they mess up the electronics on the ship itself. But when ghost hunting teams come, they find that it's really difficult to get some of their equipment to work. It's almost as though these guys are pranksters and they cause the equipment to malfunction. Now, there's no specific one person who supposedly haunts it. Like some of our stories, we're going to talk about a certain person, right, and everybody knows who it is. But in this particular instance on the Hornet, it just seems like there's multitudes of ghosts, and they're having a good time screwing with the staff and the tourists who come along and what have you. While we're on ships, the Queen Mary is well known to be one of the most haunted ships in this country as well. The Queen Mary was a private luxury liner, but during World War II, it became a troop ship. It was called the Gray Ghost because they painted this beautiful luxury ship a gray color. And there was an incident where it actually hit it was a Japanese vessel called the Kurosawa, and it cut it in half. They just couldn't stop in time. It was that simple. And the people on the Kurosawa died, and it ripped open a part of the ship, the hull of the ship of the Queen Mary. And interestingly enough, there are a lot of ghost stories about this ship. So there's this really interesting recording by a paranormal investigator that was on Unsolved Mysteries. That's probably the best place to look for it.
Okay.
And he put a recorder in the bowels of the ship in the area where it had been ripped open. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, you hear men screaming, and you hear water roaring and rushing in through a hole that no longer is in the Queen Mary. There's also an area called Shaft Alley, which is part of the mechanics area where the mechanics of the ship are. There was a watertight door where a young mechanic was crushed to death, and he is seen repeatedly by staff, either, again, following behind them or in front of them. There's a really interesting interview on that same episode of Unsolved Mysteries where they interview a woman who works at the Queen Mary at the time, and she saw a gentleman behind her in blue overalls, which was the uniform for the maintenance crew. She stepped aside for the man to pass her, and he wasn't there anymore. There's also probably the most famous ghost story of that ship is on the second class swimming pool. A elderly woman in her 60s or 70s has been seen jumping into the pool. Now, the pool isn't filled anymore, as there's no water in it, but at the time, it would have been the second class swimming pool. And there's also, in the first class swimming pool, which is still used as a swimming pool, there are little girls heard giggling, and little wet footsteps have been seen coming out of the pool.
Fun.
Yeah, it has a great deal
Mhm.
of ghost stories involved with it.
Yes, here's an invitation. If I'm in a if I'm in a haunted place and ghosts want to have fun and play tricks, have at it. Yeah,
Have
because
at it.
I would consider that an honor.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in places where they've messed with my equipment and stuff, and I wasn't upset about it. It's part of the process. I was in an old prison up in Cambria County where that happened, and it was fascinating. So another ship that we were going to talk about tonight is the USS Arizona. Now, most people will recognize it as the ship that was sunk at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. It is the event that propelled us into World War II. There were 1,102 men who died on this ship, and it still sits in the water as a memorial and a grave for those men. And there is I believe, a memorial above it. You can look down and see it and what have you. But at low tide, part of it actually comes up out of the water. This ship obviously has a great deal of tragedy associated with it. But interestingly enough, one of the ghosts is just kind of a bit of a prankster. Everybody calls him Charlie. I don't know why they call him that, but that's the name that everybody settled on for this fella. He turns on water faucets in the memorial, in the bathrooms. There's heavy doors that slide and close and open that he will open and close all by himself. And you'll hear footsteps going down hallways, doors opening and closing on camera, and there's no one there. So everybody always says that's Charlie. However, there was a soldier during this event that abandoned his post during the bombing, and he is said to haunt the deck of the ship that comes out of the water at low tide. He isn't necessarily seen very often, but he is felt. There is a great sense of sadness that will suddenly overcome some people, and sometimes they'll be terrified, and they don't know why. It is almost as though they're feeling his emotions. And I have to say, as terrible as it is to abandon your post, and I understand why the military, has made it that, obviously, but in that moment, looking at those events and you're thinking he's 18, 19, 20-year-old kid, you could see the terror that would be, there with him. And so apparently people actually express it. They feel it, his fear and his sadness over what happened. And it's been reported many, many times. So those are the two ghosts most known. Now I have to tell you, the Pearl Harbor, there's like 43 houses, I believe, buildings there, and every one of those buildings have ghost stories. It was a place of great tragedy and great passion, and that's one of the prerequisites for a ghost. It seems, is great passion and great tragedy. So the fact that most of that facility has ghost stories isn't shocking to me at all. I could spend an entire episode on just that one place, but I chose not to do that. We can go back later if people want to and talk more about that at a later date. But I just thought, to let you know that it is considered a very haunted site, and as well as a very hallowed site. Jefferson Barracks in Missouri is a home for the Army and Air National Guard. It has a couple really interesting stories. There is a story of a sentry who is seen, and he has a bullet hole in his head. So people have seen him walking along. He confronts soldiers in the barracks headquarters. And when you come upon him, you can clearly see that he was shot in the head. It is believed that he thinks he's still on duty, and that he thinks that the living soldiers are a threat in some way. So he will confront them and come up against them. He actually caused one soldier who encountered him to be so scared that he left his post, and he actually got discharged from the military because of the trauma. He was very upset. Now, there is another story, and I don't know where it came from, but it's a story that stays with this facility. So during a Halloween party at the Veterans Hospital, part of the barracks, there was this, great party going on, and the host of the party saw a gentleman in a Civil War era costume, and he was very realistic. And he walked up to the gentleman, was going to compliment him on his uniform because it was to the T, perfect. And the guy got very rude, and as he's telling off this host, he just suddenly disappeared. Well, later on, the host started asking around, and he found that no one had come to the party in a Civil War costume, and that nobody else had seen this guest but him. Now, who this guy is, nobody knows to this day, but he's definitely left his impression on one party.
Yeah, Civil War era didn't really have name tags. Or,
No, and like he nothing to distinguish who he was. That's for sure. So many people are familiar with Leavenworth. Fort Leavenworth has dozens upon dozens of haunted houses. In fact, most of them are haunted. There is a guardhouse called Tower 8, and it was part of the old disciplinary barracks area. There's a soldier who committed suicide there with his service revolver inside of Tower 8, and he will sometimes appear. People will see him, and at times he will call out of Tower 8 to the main barracks, and there's nobody in Tower 8 when this happens. He never says anything, but they can see where the call comes from, and when they go up there, it's when it's not manned, which I thought was interesting.
Again, fun as far as I would consider it. That's.
Yeah, I mean, for me too. So the next story about the Leavenworth is not quite as pleasant. So during World War II, there was an uprising, and 14 of the prisoners were executed. I should say 14 of the guards were executed. The guards were told that they would be executed 1 per hour until the prisoners' demands were met. Well, there was a gallows that was already in Leavenworth, and that's where they were going to hang them. There was apparently room for 13 on the gallows. The 14th guard was actually hung in the elevator shaft. And to this day, there are people who report hearing somebody screaming in the elevator shaft, and there's never anybody there. Not a pleasant story. I did not know that about the guards being executed 1 per hour, but there it is. Now, there are a lot of other ghosts in this particular place. There's a place called the Rookery, and it was once a base commander quarters. It's now family housing, and there's a lady in white who walks this area. She was actually tortured on the ground by some a local Native American tribe while the soldiers were off post. She was left behind in what they thought was a safe place. There was an Indian attack. She was captured and tortured to death. She is seen and heard. She will chase people walking along the grounds at night, and she screams these blood-curdling screams as she runs. She's in a white dress, a long white dress, and she seems to be an absolute terror. There's also a gentleman by the name of Major Edmund Ogden, who was served there. He and a young lady by the name of Rose, her nanny, and a gentleman named Robert are all 4 seen. Ogden seems to walk around the property, and one of the ways you know it's Ogden is he has spurs on his boots. So when you hear the spurred boots walking by you, jingling, you'll know that that's who you've encountered. And it's said that he has messed with a couple teams of ghost hunters, and he actually appeared to one of them, according to the stories, and asked them to please leave his house. And I thought that was quite interesting because you don't hear that story very often where they actually come up and talk to you and say, excuse me, but this is my place. Do you think you could just like mosey on out?
I thought that was more common than you'd think. You know, because I thought there were other stories like that of ghosts, you know, being territorial, thinking it's still their home. Yeah.
You do get that sometimes, but like to appear to a team of ghost hunters and say to them, excuse me, you need to leave my house. You once in a while you'll come across a ghost story like that, but usually not a whole lot of them these days. There's sometimes when you have to address a ghost. I mean, I've told a story about a place I was where the ghost was angry with the children in the house because they were in the area of the house that had been his private quarters. But he was, but I just found it fascinating that the guy would appear in front of this team of ghost hunters and tell them to leave his house. So not just American ghost stories.
Oh, okay.
In Pittsburgh middle school area, there's a school. This is in Germany, and this area where the school is at now was once base housing in 1956, and it was also the site of a Nazi air base. And people claim that they see gentlemen in Nazi uniforms marching through the yards and the playgrounds. There are lights that are constantly flashing on and off at night. Windows will open and close on their own, and people are heard screaming throughout the buildings after hours. Never in the daytime, but as soon as everybody settles and goes home, the staff that are there overnight and the cleaning staff and what have you have had many hair-raising experiences. And this has been going on for many, many years. So it's not like one or two guys, you know, have experienced it. There's a lot of stories about this happening there. Another place that we might be familiar with in a cursory way is Guantanamo Bay. So apparently Guantanamo Bay was actually built in 1943 as an officers club, at a base officers club. And there are 4 spirits that haunt that area, which is now called the terrorist room. The first is an old woman in white. She has long white hair and she wears a long white dress. She sits in a chair overlooking what's today the parking lot. She will mess with the lighting, and she turns the lights on a lot in the middle of the night. Now, they do have an idea who she was. Apparently, there were a couple apartments up there in that area where the club rooms are, and she died in her bathtub there, whether it was from a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. They don't make clear, but she died in her bathtub, and she's since been seen in the area that would have at one time been her apartment. The wives of the base have their own ghosts that they talk about. Mostly the commander's wives. They see a man in khaki pants walking from the living room of the CO's residence into the bathroom. This has been reported for multiple COs. There was a gentleman who was there in 2007. His wife's name was Paula Leary. She reported publicly that there was somebody else in her house, that she would see this man standing in her house. Now, her house is in an area that was once in 1901 to 1920, it was a Marine camp. He's wearing old-time khaki pants, and he would walk right past her as though she didn't exist, go into the area that was the bathroom. She followed him in, and there was nobody there. And multiple people have reported that story. I just thought that was fascinating. Now, the next story is the Battle of the Alamo. All of us know the basics of the Alamo. So Texas was fighting for independence. It was 1836. Santa Anna Mexican army was coming up from Mexico because Texas was part of Mexico, and he was trying to defend it and keep it part of the Mexican territory. So after the Battle of the Alamo, of course, the Americans lost. The Mexican general, San Jose Andrade, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. If not, I apologize. He made camp miles away from the Alamo, and he sent a group of his soldiers back to the Alamo to burn the entire Alamo down to stop the concept of diseases, because they all knew that all those dead bodies was going to cause a lot of disease in the area. So his orders a couple days after the battle was go back and burn everything. Just raise it so that there's nothing there. When they got there, they would turn around and go back without completing their mission. Their argument was that they saw 6 diablos or devils guarding the front of the old Alamo mission, and they refused to go past them because they were terrified by what they saw. And this is a part of the written record. I mean, this is a historically documentable fact because he wrote about it. There's also stories of soldiers being seen standing at guard duty. People see them walking, sometimes running almost as though they're still part of the battle. Children are heard, especially little boys, are heard or seen following groups of people, the clatter of horses' hooves on pavement. And there's a story about a man and a little boy who jump from the roof of the Alamo Mission house and just disappear. Who these people are, nobody has an idea of who they are individually, but these stories have been reported over and over again. And there's a lot of tourists that go through that area every year, and every year there are a few such reports.
I was in San Antonio for quite a long time. When I was in the Air Force, basic training, then my technical school happened to be at Lackland Air Force Base as well. So,
okay.
Yeah, so I was there for 7 months total, 7.5 months total. So yeah, I'd never heard any of those types of stories.
Well, I know that I think ghost stories have become more popular because people like they're not frowned on like they used to be, but these stories are dating back. When you look at records, you can find like a newspaper account here, you can find somebody scribbled in their journal that worked there, we got another story today of blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. A lot of these historical sites, they keep a kind of like a journal or a book that people can write in, and you can find a lot of those stories. And it's interesting whenever it turns out to be the same couple stories over and over again, or similar events going on over and over again.
Yeah, I was there end of 84 into 85. So yeah, it was before ghost hunting and ghosts became, I don't want to use the term popular, but more commonplace to talk about. Yeah.
No, it's true. They weren't popular. I will tell you that I was writing in the 80s and 90s, and I had places where I would go to talk about it, and the staff would be absolutely not, no way, no how, no, and then off to the side they would go, look, yeah, there are ghost stories here, but we're not allowed to tell them. The battlefield in Gettysburg is probably going to be one of the places that I would tell you that's happened the most. They had a gentleman who was running it who just absolutely hated the concept of ghost stories, and he forbade the staff there to tell stories for the entirety of his time there. So even though the stories escaped, which they did, and we'll talk about them in a little bit, it was difficult to get the stories in the 70s and 80s, because in the early 90s even, because they were told not to talk about this stuff. Now I came to a story that I thought was really interesting and very different. This is not one that most people will know. So most people will recognize the name, however. So we have George S. Patton, General Patton, he defined himself as a Christian gentleman, but he also believed in reincarnation. And here's why he believed in reincarnation. I know that sounds odd. He, as a child, was convinced that he had fought with the Turkish armies. He said he had memories of this, that he had fought beside a guy by the name of John the Blind of Bohemia in the 1300s. And then as a young man, he was kicked by a horse and he almost died from his injuries. And while he was in bed, he had a vision of his death as a Viking in a previous life. This would continue throughout his life, where he would have these visions, if you will. He would claim at one point as an adult, he was in battle and he was struggling. And he said that he had a dream where he was a soldier in Greece. He also claimed that he had fought in the 1st century as a Roman soldier who had died after several arrows went through his neck. And he remembered being stationed in France as a Roman legionnaire during in Caesar's army. He would talk about the reign of King Henry V, and that he had fought alongside Alexander the Great. But my favorite two stories of his are actually stories of his own. He had an instance where he was in World War I when he was a young man, where he was in a particularly bad, vicious battle, and he found himself on the ground. He was scared to death. He couldn't stand up and fight. He was very young at this point. And suddenly he saw the faces of his dead grandfather and his uncles come before him, and they demanded that he stop being a coward and that he needs to stand up and keep fighting, in which he did. And later in his life, he would visit a city in France where he knew where everything was at. Like he entered this city and he drove to places and told people, this is where this is at and this is where this is at. And he even gave a Frenchman a tour of the ruins of the Romans that were in the city in France. He knew where the parade grounds had been. He knew all of this information. Now, I'm not sure if anybody knows, there's a bit of a controversy about Patton's death. He died in a freak car accident in 1945. If you want to get more reference on this, there's always been a conspiracy theory that he was murdered because some of his plans for what to do at the end of World War II were unpopular. He wanted to continue on in and defeat the Russians. They were our allies at the time. And he had been in some major arguments with some very, very powerful members of the military. And there was actually a really cool documentary Brad Meltzer did about the possibility of this. So you can look that up. He has a great show on a series on conspiracies on the History Channel, and he did an episode on this possible event. Anyhow, he was shot and killed, or was killed by this accident, not shot, excuse me. He was killed by this accident. He went to the hospital and died there a little while later. He had two daughters. His first daughter's name was Ruth Ellen, and she could not be there when her father was dying. This happened pretty quickly, and so she didn't get there. She was in bed at the time that he passed away, and she woke up because there was a light in the room, and he was standing at the foot of her bed. She would describe him as being dressed in his full military uniform. She said, I sat in bed, and I could see him plainly. When he saw that I was looking at him, he gave to me the sweetest smile I have ever seen and faded away. His other daughter, she was Beatrice. She was there with her father and had been with him that night of his death. She said that after she had left the hospital, the phone rang, and she picked it up, and there was a lot of static on the line, but then she could hear her father's voice, and he said, his pet nickname for her was Little B. Little B, are you all right? And then the line went dead, and so she said, I called the overseas operator who said that no one had made these calls, and yet I heard my father's voice one last time, which I thought was a lovely story.
Yeah, Mrs. Stu and I have been to the American Cemetery in Luxembourg where he's buried.
Have you?
Yeah.
It's like in a history sense, if anybody's fascinated with history, and you all know I'm a history geek, his life is a novel, and it's beyond a novel. And if you read some of the stuff that he warned about at the end of the war, he was right. Like, he saw where things were going. He talked about the Cold War. He talked about all of the things that were going to happen. And had he been allowed to follow through, it would have changed the course of history for every country in in Europe and for, of course, the United States as well. So it's a fascinating to look at his thought process and see how forward thinking he was. And then to go ahead and look at the conspiracy, because there's a very interesting conspiracy theory about his death. And I highly recommend taking a jaunt down that rabbit hole if you get a chance.
Mm-hmm. That does sound interesting. Yeah.
It is interesting. I'll have to try to find that episode and send it to you. Because it was a fascinating episode. I must have watched it 3 times over because I kept finding new things in it, going, wow, I didn't know that, But it's fascinating to hear the things that he recognized and realized. He could have saved the world so much pain had he been allowed to follow through.
Well,
Or at least it would have been different.
yeah, yeah. You always hear those stories. What if you could go back in time and stop Hitler from taking over Germany as Chancellor of Germany, and what just would have happened to the world? Well, maybe somebody did know and did just that. Yeah. So who knows?
But I just thought it was really fascinating that he could see so far ahead. He talked about, look, we need to subdue Russia, or it's going to become a world power and it's going to try to challenge us. And like, he was saying stuff that ended up happening. But then I wonder sometimes if there wasn't a contingent of people that wanted that, because there's a lot of money in war. Yeah, unfortunately, fortunately, that is true, sadly.
Well, there's a lot of inventions that came out of war as well. So
there are
things that are used afterwards in civilian life. So
there are.
I don't want to justify war, but that's if you're going to have a silver lining to anything, that may be. But
I just found it interesting to listen to what all he had said, because it was so prophetic. If you look at it today, oh my God, how did he know that? And yet he was adamant. But of course, we cannot visit ghosts of the military without going to Gettysburg.
I knew you were going there. In fact, I'm surprised you didn't start out with that.
I just thought I would end with my favorite stuff. So.
Okay. Fair enough.
Gettysburg College is very well known to be haunted. During the battle, it was used as field hospital space. Of course, every place in Gettysburg was field hospital space. Unfortunately, there was just, there was 51,000 injured and dead after 4 days of battle. It was a horrendous scene. In the 1980s, though, my dear friend Mark Nesbitt tells this story so much better than I, but I'm going to borrow it from him. He had two friends who were administrators at the Pennsylvania Hall, and one evening they stayed to work late, and it was pretty late in the evening, about 10, 11 o'clock at night by the time they were done with their tasks, and they got in the elevator together to go out to the parking lot and go home. They punched the button on the elevator, and the elevator went down, but it didn't stop at the first floor, which is where they anticipated it stopping. It continued on to the basement level, and they're like hitting the button to make it go back up, and it's not doing it. The doors open, and in the basement, they see a surgeon, and he's got bloody hands, and he's working on soldiers, and there's just all these horrible, mutilated soldiers laying there. And the surgeons of that day would be covered with blood. They were sawing limbs off and what have you. He looked up at them with this beseeching look, and they're pounding the elevator buttons at this point. They're terrified of what they're seeing. They go back up. But interestingly enough, they don't think, oh my God, I saw a ghost. They think we saw college kids pulling a prank. So they run and find somebody on the staff that's there for security, gets the security guard, and they go back to the basement, and the basement is completely normal looking now. There is no sign, and this took less than 5 minutes. There is no way that elaborate set and all that stuff, the blood all over the floors, the whole 9 yards, could have been cleared up and moved out of there in 5 minutes. Now, interestingly enough, Mark would, and he tells this story when he speaks, Mark would run into a couple other people who have had similar experiences there. There was, he was telling the story, and after the story was told at an event we were at, this person came up to him and said, oh, you must have gotten the story from my friends. And he's like, this person named them, and he's like, no, he knew these women personally that had this experience, and it wasn't this name. So he's like, that's very odd. And they're like, no, our friends had the same experience. And he's had a couple times where people have come up to him and given him the information, and he's talked with these other people, and they indeed had a very similar experience. The elevator going to the basement when it wasn't supposed to, the doors opening, the gentleman looking at them beseechingly, the blood, the gore, the piles of limbs, the whole 9 yards. And, not only do the staff have problems there, but the entire student body has. There's many of them throughout the years who've had stories. There's a girl by the name of Gabby Gill who was there her freshman year. She was in Huber Hall. She said she would wake up. She woke up one night and she had a pressure on her chest. She heard somebody dragging something across the floor. She thought she was like in that waking, dreaming state. She heard it again and again. She finally got up and looked, and every item on her desk and her roommate's desk had been thrown one by one across the room onto the floor. And they were alone in the room, both of them sound asleep. There's other people. There's another student who reported that he awoke one night and he felt somebody touching or brushing against his feet over and over again. He stuck his feet out from under the blankets, and he woke up to see who was moving, and he saw 3 black silhouettes. And as he saw them, they raised up lanterns, and he could see that the light was shining in, brightly. And he said, he sat up, and all 3 of them just turned and left the room. In the morning, he told his friends about this bizarre experience. And they said, one of them said, "Oh my God, I felt something with its arms around me last night, and I was afraid I wouldn't open my eyes." So there's so many such stories like that. And you hear them from tourists. There's the very famous story of Little Round Top, where the Texans fought. And there's always reports throughout the years of a man who they call a hippie. So he has no shoes, his pants are ragged, his hair is long, his beard unkept, and he's moving along the area where the monument is, walking along, and people will, they kind of feel pity for him. He looks very disheveled and obviously doesn't even have money for a pair of shoes. And people have approached him and he has disappeared. People have tried to get photographs of him and there's never anything there. People have tried to give him money, and again, he disappears. And what people don't realize is that every state was responsible to provide their soldiers with supplies. So if you were from Pennsylvania and you were in Virginia or Maryland, it was pretty easy for our state to get supplies to their men. But if you were from Texas and you were traveling all the way back east, well, you can imagine how difficult it would have been to get supplies to catch up with these men. They were always on the march. So a lot of the Texas soldiers, by the time they got to Gettysburg, they looked like vagabonds and hippies. No shoes, their clothes was ragged and holes all through them, long hair, bushy beards. They were very unkept because their supplies couldn't get to them. And this man has been seen many, many times. There are lots of sightings of soldiers. There's this really interesting one I found. So somebody was writing some stories about Gettysburg, and he talked about he was interviewing a librarian who came to a speaking engagement of his, and she was from Connecticut, and she said, "I've never seen a ghost in Connecticut, but I did in Pennsylvania." So the gist of her story is that she was part of a group that was escorting some high school kids to a field trip in Gettysburg. They had rented a van. They were going to come and spend the weekend and then turn around and go back with these kids. Since they had the van, this afforded them the luxury of being able to just wander all over the battlefields at will. So they took the van and they were running out, it was late afternoon, getting near dusk, and they saw this little dirt road coming out of Devil's Den, and they go down it, and they see a gentleman standing in the field ahead of them, and he's got on a Confederate general's uniform. He's got a hat, a sash, the insignia, the whole 9 yards. Perfect uniform. And as they're driving, he's ahead of them, just walking through the field. And they decide they're going to pull up and get his attention because they're not quite sure how to get turned around and get back to Gettysburg. And as the battlefield closes at dusk, and it's almost dusk, they need to get moving. So they pull up to where he's standing and wind down the window, and he's simply gone. Now, if anybody's familiar with Devil's Den, it's a very cleared out area. There's really nowhere to go in that field across from it. It's just short grass and a couple saplings. There's nothing there anymore. They've cleared that all out. So they have no clue where he was. He just faded away as they pulled up to him. But I have to tell you, this is my last story, and I apologize if I know I've told it before, but it is probably my quintessential Gettysburg story. years and years ago when Mark and I had just begun to be friends. We were doing a book signing on 4th of July weekend, of course, the Battle of Gettysburg weekend. And we were sitting in town signing books, and throughout the day we would have different people come through, and they would tell us the same stories of hearing gunfire or smelling gunpowder in the same areas. They were from all over. But there was this one young woman who came in. She was in her early 20s, and she was absolutely shaking. I mean, literally physically shaking. She was just about in tears. And she would get in my line, and my line would thin out as I would sign books. And then she would go over and get in Mark's line, and his line would thin out as he signed books. And she would go back to the corner and stand for a moment uncertainly. And finally, there was a little bit of a lull. And I said to Mark, she's going to cry. You need to do something. And he goes, you do something. You're a girl, you know, kind of a deal. And I said to her, excuse me, are you okay? And she came up and she said that she was a newlywed, and her husband had came to Gettysburg for the weekend. He was a big Civil War buff, and she was not. So they were out at Devil's Den, and there's these huge boulders for those who have never been there, huge boulders, 20, 30 feet high. And he had climbed up on top of them, and he was looking, you know, at the terrain along with a bunch of the tourists. She was bored and hot, and she decided that the nice air-conditioned car was a much better vantage point. So she heads for her car, and as she's going along, this young Confederate soldier comes out of the growth there along the other side. At that time, it was still kind of overgrown. Since then, the Gettysburg battlefield has cleaned that whole area out, but at the time, it was still kind of an overgrown area. And she almost bumped into him, and she said, excuse me, and he stopped, and he seemed shocked that she could see him. And he goes, ma'am, and he had this very thick Southern accent. Ma'am, my name is Timmy Wells, and I'm with the 4th Tennessee, 104th Tennessee. And he's going on, he's telling her that he just wants to go home and see his mama. Please, can you tell him I just want to go home and see my mama? And she's thinking, damn, he's really good. Now, a lot of these reenactors pick a person and they bring them to life.
Right.
And that's what she was thinking. And he continues on, and she starts to say something to him. And at that point, an older man, dark black beard, black hair, probably 10 to 15 years older than this boy, comes stepping out of the same area, and he yells in a very deep, thick accent, Timmy, Timmy, come on. We got to go, son. And the boy picks a flower, and he hands it to her, and he says, I got to go. You've been a peach of a belle, ma'am. Thank you. And he goes off towards the older man, and at that point, the older man and the boy just simply disappear. They fade away. And she's standing there with his flower clutched in her hand, and she hears people on the top of the rocks with her husband screaming, did you see that? Did you see that? And he had come running down, and she was so rattled. He got her in the car, and they were looking for a place to stop to tell this story. And anybody who'd ever been in Gettysburg in July knows it's very difficult to find parking. They had seen the ghosts of Gettysburg Candlelight walking to our sign, and they thought maybe this guy would believe them. So he let her off at the corner, and then he went to find parking. He was several minutes behind her, and when he came in, she had just finished her story. And he's like, did you tell him? Did you tell him what you saw? He was as agitated as she was in a certain way, and he told the exact same story from his perspective on the rocks. Now, I got my curiosity piqued, and I talked with Mark, and Mark gave me the name of a gentleman from Tennessee who was a historian. And we did find that there was a private, Timmy Wells, who fought at Gettysburg, who fought with the Texans up on Little Round Top, which is right above the Devil's Den area. And he was presumed dead and missing at the end of the battle. Was he that boy? I don't know. But it's a fascinating coincidence.
That story never gets old.
I absolutely love that story because I'll never forget that young woman's look of shock and the sincerity. Her whole body quivered. She was so surprised by what had happened to her. And I'll never forget the sincerity of that moment. Like, I've met people that tell me ghost stories and I know they just want to get on a book, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But this girl was shaken from end to end. And that is my last ghost story for tonight.
And quite a good one. I don't want to make it sound like you're repeating the same thing over and over and over again, because you certainly aren't. But yeah, as many times as I've heard that story, I'm enraptured every time. Even though I know how it's going to turn out, because I'm listening to how you spin the tale, and it never changes, obviously. But yeah, so I'm very much I like that one a lot.
I do too, and I try not to tell it more than once or twice a year. But I mean, there are certain times whenever it fits, and it just fits so well. And I wanted to like kind of bring it home to say, you know, every ghost story, when we talk about military ghosts and stuff like that, it's no different than any other ghost. It's still somebody's son, brother, husband, whatever it is, you know, daughter, wife, whatever. And we tend to romanticize military and war and all of that. And I get why we do that. These people are bigger in life, bigger than some of their actions. But at the end of the day, they're still somebody's family. And I try never to forget that. And somewhere out there, there was a mom who grieved for the loss of Timmy Wells. That was my last ghost story, because it's one I actually saw a little piece of.
Mm-hmm. Well, dear friends, if you've enjoyed Patty's stories, as I have, please do us the service of, you know, clicking the like button down below if you're watching this on YouTube or through your podcast platform. Give us a commensurate rating, you know, if you've enjoyed them. Don't forget, we have the Facebook group, The Paranormalist Podcast, and the email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. And those are both pretty long, so I'll put links for them down in the show notes as well, so you can just click on them instead of having to remember and type them in for yourselves. All right. And so with that, I would say thank you, Patty, and until the next time.
Until the next time, my friend. Good night.
Good night.